I want to welcome each and every one of you here again today. This is a very, very exciting conference, and it's always good to be back in a school setting in September. Even at the ripe old age of 60, I still get excited about going to school, so it's nothing like being here at Harvard again, talking about an issue that is near and dear to each and every one of us here. I've been a reporter for 30 years, and the amount of technology that has changed is just fascinating and amazing to me. Even though it requires some adaptability and patience with the evolution of all this, it still comes back to telling a story. And that story has to be told in a way that has impact, in a way that you can measure some results, in a way that changes public perception. You look at some of the folks today that are running political campaigns and how they can, I'm not going to use the word lie, but I mean, the word is persuade their base. And so we have two excellent panelists today. One who is no stranger here to Harvard College. He attended the school and the law school. Alan Jenkins is now a distinguished career in law. Man, it's always an honor to be around bright and all right, that's enough of that. Okay. And then Tiffany Manuel, who's a doctorate from UMass Boston, and some of the work that she has done at Frameworks and now at Enterprise, and how not only to shape your message, but to understand how an audience receives that message and acts on that message, I think is a powerful connection that we should all sort of be aware of and implement in our own lives. So without further ado, I'd like to bring up Alan Jenkins, and he's going to have a presentation. And again, some housekeeping things real quick. Lunch is right after this at 1 o'clock. It's downstairs. Be careful about folks that'll be on camera, so make sure that you're aware of that. Please have your cell phones squared away. And we want to spend a lot of time with questions when the time is appropriate. And I, for one, do not mind non-questions and shared experience. I like those things, and I'm that kind of moderator that will let it run. So please be cognizant of everybody's time. We don't have that much time, so let's get it going. Mr. Jenkins.
All right. Thanks very much, Howard. How are you all feeling? All right, that was lame. Let's try it again. This is about communications. How are you all feeling? All right, now we're talking. Okay, so awesome. I was about to stall for a minute till we got that up. Let me just ask some of you to shout out. Well, first of all, let me ask, how many of you sometimes encounter challenges when you are trying to persuade a person or an audience about reforming our criminal justice system? Right, very few of you. Some of you maybe you just talked to your awesome family, but almost everyone said you experienced that challenge, despite the fact that we are in a unique and remarkable moment where there is greater interest and support for fundamentally changing our criminal justice system than at any point probably since almost any of us in the room have been alive. And so I want to talk to you a little bit about the work that my organization, the Opportunity Agenda, does. Our mission is building the national will to expand opportunity in America. And for us, fundamentally changing our criminal justice system to be one that is about opportunity and ensuring that everyone has a fair chance to achieve their full potential is at the core of our work. We're a social justice communication lab, and so our work is helping people to use communications and culture to build public support and activism for lasting policy change and attitudinal change. And so we lost a little time, so I'm going to kind of work a little more quickly than I had intended to work through some of what I want to discuss. Despite the growing public support, we also know that we're seeing the return of a narrative of fear. When we hear people talk about the so-called Ferguson effect, that police officers are supposedly not enforcing the law because they're afraid of accountability, despite the fact that we have yet to see any accountability in Ferguson. When we talk about the very real deaths and murders in Chicago, when we think about the real threat of terrorism, that tends to drive up people's fear, which tends to drive down their support for changes that make sense, for positive changes. And so what are we going to do about that? I want to give you a very quick quiz just to make sure you're all with me. You're going to shout out. You'll definitely know the first one. We'll see if you know the second one. So if I said to you, computer plus creative plus genius, what brand? What brand? Apple. Okay, nobody said Gateway, right? If I said to you, car plus safe, what brand? Volvo. Everyone always knows that. There's always one Toyota in the bunch. But the answer is Volvo, okay. How do we know that? Probably none of you know the safety ratings on a Volvo, or there's no way of quantifying the creative factor of Apple. But this is a story. These are stories that have been told to you over and over and over again. And they're stories rooted in values and identity. We want to think of ourselves as creative geniuses. We're attracted to the Apple brand, which is right now the strongest brand in the world. Those of us who care about safety, young people tend not to know the answer to that Volvo question, because a lot of them can't afford to buy a car, and if they do, they're not thinking about safety, right? But the point here is that we need to be as strategic in telling our story of a criminal justice system, a justice system that is truly just, tied to values and positive stories. This is a different example. I found this in my mother-in-law's supermarket. Any of you know this pancake brand, K-R-U-S-T-E-A-Z? Well, so I said, to myself, who was the marketing genius who came up with crusty-ass pancakes? Now, my mother-in-law said, no, it's crusty. Does it really matter? This is a bad name for a pancake company. Why am I sharing this with you? Because a lot of us, when we talk about criminal justice reform, we are selling crusty-ass pancakes. We are speaking in a language that only people who already agree with us can understand. We're using jargon. We're failing to use images to tap into values. And so if you get nothing else from my remarks today, don't sell crusty-ass pancakes. We're going to talk about what that means as a practical matter. Let me show you one other piece of multimedia which hopefully will get your creative juices flowing and is about the power of storytelling. Okay, does that look familiar to any of you? Can you see yourself in that? Can you see your transition from Arial Black to Helvetica Bold? I want to talk to you very quickly about seven of the lessons we've learned in the communication space. And some of them, I should say, that we have learned from Tiffany's organization, Frameworks Institute, or your former organization. And others are from research and experience we've gotten working with lots of folks around the country. So I want to give you this, and then we'll have time to talk about it. later in the session. And then I want you to also reach out to our organization, which you can find at opportunityagenda.org. We have a wealth of materials, public opinion research, media analysis, messaging guidance. I want you to sign up so that when something good or bad happens in the world, you will very quickly get an email from us about what research and experience tells us about how to talk about it. Okay, so first is understanding our audience. Right? Who are we talking to? There are a couple of ways of thinking about audience. Many of you will may be thinking, yes, we've got to convince the general public. There is no general public when it comes to strategic communications. We don't have the resources to reach everyone. Luckily, we don't have to. So here's one way of thinking about strategic audiences, is decision makers and influencers, the people who have the power to make the decision that you want made. Maybe it's the governor, maybe it's the swing voters, maybe it's others, board of directors, and then who influences them. And the more we can focus our communications resources and knowledge, right, understanding those audiences, what they care about and what they share with us, the more successful we can be, particularly with limited communications resources. Here's another way to think about audience. If ones on the left are your base who are with you, your job is to activate them. Fives, your opposition. Your job is to ignore them or to marginalize their message so they don't influence the twos, threes, and fours, who are the vast majority of people you will be dealing with on your issues. And so you don't bring a message that is designed to mobilize a one, your base, to an audience that is filled with fours. It will inherently fall flat. Second is leading with shared values. So a lot of us in the work we do, we like to lead with policies. But imagine you go home for Thanksgiving in a few weeks and your cousin asks you, what are you working on? And you say, well, I'm trying to make sure that the mandatory minimums that have been made up, right, they're already turning to talk to somebody else. Right? It doesn't speak to them, they don't know the details, they're not sure how to talk about it. The next level up that we sometimes talk about is issues, right? I want to talk to you about police violence, about drug policy. People know what you're talking about, but chances are they're bringing their own story, right? They have their own experience, their own narrative that they are bringing, and that may or may not fit with the story that you want to tell or the solutions that you're promoting. And so 9 times out of 10, we recommend leading with values, with the values that you share with your audience. So if you're at that Thanksgiving dinner and somebody says, well, what are you working on? And you say, well, we believe, my organization believes that we need a criminal justice system that keeps all communities safe, that prevents crime, and that upholds the values of equal justice. And let me tell you about how we're doing that. Different conversation. Now, depending on your cousin, they might still turn and talk to somebody else about, the game. But imagine, for those threes and fours, the people who are persuadable but not yet with you, why that's a different kind of conversation. I'm going to skip this slide because we're tight on time, but you would have loved it. Okay. What are some of the... You see, you heard the moderator told me I got time. I don't know how the organizers are going to feel about you giving me the leeway. But this is Brian Stevenson. Many of you know him, heads the Equal Justice Initiative of Alabama. I want to give you a quick clip of him talking about race and the death penalty to an audience of lawyers.
In the United States, we are struggling with capital punishment and its implementation. A short, quick legal history. In 1972, the United States Supreme Court struck down the death penalty after recognizing that it was being applied in an arbitrary manner. The court in 72 noted that 87% of the people executed for the crime of rape were black men convicted of raping white women. 100% of the people executed in the United States between 1930 and 1972 for the crime of rape were executed for offenses involving victims who were white, even though it was believed that women of color were 3 times as likely to be the victims of sexual assault.
Okay, let's stop that one there. So if you, like me, are somebody who believes that the death penalty is inherently racially biased and otherwise wrong, then this is probably pretty convincing. But think about those threes and fours, the persuadables, who probably are bringing a mindset of don't do the crime if you can't do the time, that if you have murdered someone, you have given up your right to be considered for human rights, and may even be thinking, so what, I could care less what the race is of who you killed or the person convicted of a crime. Let me quickly show you a different way that Brian tells this same story.
I was giving this lecture in Germany, some lectures in Germany about the death penalty. It was fascinating because one of the scholars stood up after the presentation and said, it's deeply troubling to hear what you're talking about. He said, well, we don't have the death penalty in Germany. And of course, we can never have the death penalty in Germany. And the room got very quiet, and this woman said, there's no way with our history we could ever engage in the systematic killing of human beings. It would be unconscionable for us to, in an intentional, deliberate way, set about executing people. And I thought about that. What would it feel like to be living in a world where the nation-state of Germany was executing people, especially if they were disproportionately Jewish? I couldn't bear it. It would be unconscionable. And yet in this country, in the states of the Old South, we execute people. where you're 11 times more likely to get the death penalty if the victim is white than if the victim is black, 22 times more likely to get it if the defendant is black than the victim is white. In the very states where there are buried in the ground the bodies of people who were lynched, and yet there is this disconnect.
Okay, were you all able to hear that? Yes. I apologize for the low audio. Think about the differences in those presentations. Brian is tapping our shared values. He's telling a story. He's using imagery. He's using the metaphor of Germany and its legacy. But importantly, he's not saying the death penalty in the South is just like the Holocaust, right? That would be rejected. It's not really accurate. But he is telling us why the principle of equal justice, the idea that what you look like, where you come from, what religion you believe in should have no bearing on how you were treated in the justice system, and certainly whether or not you're executed. He's reminding us of values in a way that then allows many audiences, these persuadable audiences, to hear the rest of what he has to say, including those statistics. Are you with me so far? Mm-hmm. Okay, audience. Lead with values. These are some of the values that research and experience show are particularly important in talking about our criminal justice system. Some of this, again, comes from the frameworks research. Others come from other parts of our work. But think about the power of talking about the chance to start over, that everyone in our country needs the chance to start over. There was actually a speech that, you remember Dick Cheney, vice president under Bush, gives about America being a nation of second chances. This is relevant for a guy who, you may remember, shot someone in the face in a hunting trip with no ramifications whatsoever. Okay, but Americans do hold that value, and so think about the implications for reentry, for the importance of drug treatment, and the like. So those are some of our values. Lesson number 3 is telling a systemic story. We spent some time talking about this, that individual stories are very compelling, and people want to hear about them, but often by telling an individual story, good or bad, we lead our audience to individualize definitions of the problem and the solution. So if we tell the story of someone who came through the system and got their life back together, that kind of story can lead to, well, if more people had true grit like her, then the problem would be solved. Right? Rather than what were the systems, the opportunities that she had to get her life back on track, and how could we expand those so that more people could take advantage. Similarly with negative stories about problems and when things go wrong. So that doesn't mean that we abandon human stories, but we have to tell human stories that are inherently systemic. So think about Rosa Parks and her story. Compelling human story, but also inherently connected to a larger struggle to end segregation, and in that case in buses and then beyond. Her story was an inherently systemic story. Think about, you all remember Erin Brockovich, the person in the film, right? Another inherently systemic human individual story. Sometimes it's the stories of people, for instance, in law enforcement, talking about why we need to use mental health treatment approaches, for example, rather than arrest. Sometimes it's people inside the system. Sometimes it's people who are themselves affected by the problem. But picking those stories carefully, really important. Fourth, this is really important. Talking about the obstacles, especially when it comes to unequal justice and racial bias. The unequal obstacles that people are facing first before we jump to the outcomes. So many of you have heard, some of you may have said, in many cities in the United States, 1 out of every 3 men of color finds himself in prison or jail. And for many of us, we think, well, that proves racial bias. But for a lot of our audiences, our 3s and 4s, what does it prove? That black and brown folks are prone to criminality, because we haven't taken the time to explain the obstacles, the unequal treatment that communities of color and people of color receive, the difference in policing, the difference in prosecutorial discretion, the difference in sentencing, the obstacles facing reentry, the difference in being tried as an adult if you're a young person based on race for having engaged in the identical conduct. If we short-circuit that and jump straight to the outcomes, we miss our audiences who are, remember, carrying around subconscious stereotypes in their heads, as we all do. Right? It's nothing unique to the 4s and 5s of the world. We all carry around those stereotypes. We saw some of that play out in the last panel, right? About who people are and what they are prone to do. And so we have to explain those obstacles, very important. I am going to skip this slide, which is about that video, which is about implicit bias. 5. Emphasizing solutions. This is absolutely critical, especially for those of us who are advocates. There's an expression, there's a reason why Martin Luther King Jr.'s most important speech was not called "I have a complaint." Let it soak in, right? But for so many of us, we are much better at talking about what we are against than what we're for. A lot of people who could be with us, right, can't visualize the solutions that we're articulating. And therefore, they go back to the default, right, which is prison and jail and policing. And so we have to talk about restorative justice approaches. We have to talk about the power of making sure that drug treatment, for example, is available to everyone who needs it, that mental health treatment and services are available, that what the difference will be, how will the world be different, and where is it working? Absolutely crucial to be able to point to those. 6, we're almost done. Elevating the voices and leadership of those most affected. This goes to my prior point about the systemic stories. These are all folks, you may know some of them, but they are all leaders who came through the Opportunity Agenda's Communications Institute. It's a 5-day media and communications training. But they all are leaders in their own organizations, and they are all formerly incarcerated folks. They all have an inherently human, individual story, and they all have an inherently systemic story, because their day-to-day work is to improve and in some cases, radically transform the criminal justice system. Telling their stories is absolutely crucial, because that's a part of the stereotypes that people are carrying. Glenn Martin, for example, who some of you may know, is adept at when he reveals that he is himself formerly incarcerated. Sometimes he will come into a room as an expert. Sometimes he'll come into a room as an advocate, sometimes as a dad, sometimes he's leading with his status as a formerly incarcerated American. But he always describes his experience, and he uses it in a way that reminds people of the systems. And he talks about the opportunities he had to re-enter and reclaim his life that many others don't have. Finally, breaking harmful stereotypes. We need to be aware of those stereotypes that people are carrying around. We need to avoid them, and where we can, we need to break them. I'm just going to mention the very top one, which is people over labels. So many of us in the field of criminal justice reform will nonetheless use terms like offenders, like prisoners, like inmates, instead of people with criminal convictions, people who have been accused or convicted of a crime. People, people, people. I hope you will go back to all your materials, your website. Every time you see an ERS at the end of one of these labels, put in people who, people with, people who've experienced. Because every time we use those labels, we are, number one, labeling people often by the worst thing that they've ever done, and we are sending a signal to our audiences about the folks about whom we're speaking. So that part is absolutely crucial. I'm now going to conclude with your bonus lesson and quick story. My wife and I our daughter was entering high school, and so we went to a presentation at the high school about, welcoming and the like, and the principal spoke, and she was great, and the head guidance counselor spoke, and he was pretty good. And then the head of security, who's a woman, actually a police officer, spoke. And she said, if you listen to the rumors, you'd probably believe that our high school is an open-air drug market. But believe me, it's not an open-air drug market. So once again, not an open-air drug market. So at this point, my wife and I are in a fetal position. We're sending our daughter to an open-air drug market. Oh my God, oh my God. I had never even heard that that was the reputation of the school. Okay? And then she explained to us why it's not an open-air drug market. I could not tell you a single one of the reasons that she told us. What I remember, and what the research shows, is if you bust myths and you come back to your audience 2 weeks later, they remember. You got it. And yet, I bet if you go back to your own materials and your own websites, some of you have documents that say 7 myths about people returning from prison, right? 10 ways in which you've got it all wrong, right? That's a magazine format because it tends to attract people's attention, but it's a terrible and actually counterproductive way of conveying true fact. And so what do we do instead? We tell our affirmative story. So instead of saying, well, you may have heard that undocumented immigrants don't pay taxes, but that's a myth, you tell the story of, let me tell you the ways in which immigrants, including undocumented immigrants, are contributing to our economy and our society. They are creating jobs. They are working. And they're paying taxes. They're paying Social Security taxes, for example, that they will never benefit from. They're paying sales taxes. They're contributing to our economy. If you didn't know the myth, you now have not heard it from me, nor have I deepened my opponents, the fives of the world, their story. So I have a lot more to say, but I don't want to blow through our time, so I'm going to stop there. I look forward to the rest of our conversation.
All right, well, good morning. So that was fantastic. Thank you, Alan. And I have to say that, when I started out in this sort of thinking about how we frame communications and think about this probably 10, 15 years ago, there was not the kind of robust understanding of these issues that there are today. And I was just telling one of my colleagues at Frameworks, we were talking about the communications network stuff that's happening next week and a couple weeks from now in Detroit, and just how far we've come, really in terms of understanding how to better position the things that we want to say for broader public consumption, because it's really difficult. And what's difficult about it is that the conversation we were just having, that incredibly rich conversation we just had, is really hard. You all know this, right? To convey effectively to the broader public, right? The many publics, right, that are out there. And so the challenge for Frameworks, for Opportunity Agenda, for lots of folks who are now kind of in this space, is how do we do a better job of that, knowing how effective and important storytelling is to making sure that people get what we want to say. So I will say before I start, I have a couple of videos in the presentation that have not quite exactly transitioned to this technology, so y'all bear with me. I have the videos on a zip drive, and I'm going to try to sort of transition between PowerPoint and the videos and yada, yada, yada. But we'll see whether that happens. If they don't happen, I'll talk through it, and if they do happen, then great. So let me just launch in here, and let me just say that I actually am not sort of currently working at the Frameworks Institute. I work at the Enterprise Community Partners, again, partnering with Frameworks on a whole range of issues. Frameworks is an organization like Op Agenda who works really hard to get folks who are in the social justice space to think more intentionally and strategically about how we're positioning issues, especially when there is a catalytic moment. I think there are a couple of policy areas where there is really an opportunity, if we take advantage of it, to really reposition reform, right? Criminal justice is an area where there is a real opportunity to really reposition policy. I work in the housing and community development space. There's a real opportunity because of some of the recent Supreme Court cases to really transition folks and to really think about how we change the system. But we got to be smart. This is not the time, right, to go back to the old ways of talking, ways that did not help us, right, to build a broader tent and to lift support for what we're talking about, right? If you really care about this issue, then you should care enough to get smart about how you talk about it externally. So here's a catalytic moment. Y'all know this. On the newspapers every single day, which is amazing to me, race. I I just love that. Now, it's happening in the wrong way because people are, right, we have a presidential campaign that's happening and both candidates are going back and forth about who's racist and who's not and et cetera. And it's happening in a very corrosive, myopic, reductionistic way. It's not nuanced, it's not detailed, it's not thoughtful, but it's happening. We have Black Lives Matter who are in the streets every day trying to figure out how to lift these issues up. We have riots even in places, protests, right? I mean, last year we had the Baltimore stuff was going on. That's where I spent a lot of my time in the streets, still trying to figure out how to lift these issues up. There is a real catalytic moment for a lot of good stuff to happen. The challenge for us is it's not coming easy and it's not coming, and it's difficult, right? So I have a couple quotes up here that really just talk a little bit about, from my vantage point, in terms of thinking about the community development space, how this is playing out. This notion, of course, that are characterizing all of the neighborhoods that people of color live in as these awful places that nobody ever wants to visit, that awful people live there, bad people, bad places. What the hell do we do with them, right? And a presidential candidate who says, stick with me, I'll do something about it. I can't tell you what, but I'm going to do something about that. And so the reality of seeing this catalytic moment and having a public discourse that is incredibly myopic, right, is just incredibly challenging for us. So I want to do a couple things first. I want to depress you a little bit more than perhaps you already are about what the challenges are. But then I hope at the end, in the way that I think Alan just did, was really to give us hope that there really is a way of thinking more strategically about the way we communicate about some of these issues. So the way that we tend to think about this at Frameworks is this notion is that there is this kind of gulf that separates the folks in this room who really think very deeply about these issues, have a very nuanced position, and the broader public and policymakers. And we're trying desperately to sort of get our message across that gulf of understanding. And what often happens is what we call the backfire effect. Now, some of you, and I have this cartoon, which happens a lot for us. We think that we are sharing information, and what often happens is a huge backfire. You say something like, what people are struggling in the world, and like many of our participants this morning, folks in community are struggling hard to raise their families. They get caught up in the criminal justice system. That shouldn't be the end of their lives. We have to figure out a way to make this better. And you know what the defaults are, right? You know where people go when they hear that. They don't go, yeah, that's right. There's so much stuff happening in communities, and it's so sad that that's happening, and we should do something about that. That's not what they say. In fact, it backfires. It comes back at us when we walk that language out in that same way. And people say all kinds of things that are challenging for us. Now, I want to just say, I'm not just pontificating because I think that this is true. There's a whole scientific literature over the last 30 years that is called the backfire effect. If you haven't heard of it, I suggest you Google it, because there are studies, about 30 years of studies that say when you try and get this kind of information in front of folks and they don't have an understanding of it, they don't perceive it to be the truth, what do? Not only do they deny it, but there's something even more corrosive that happens. Say it again. They blame you, but even worse than that. They dig in. They dig into the stuff that you can say, I got facts and figures. I have all this stuff to tell you why this is wrong, why this is hurting my community, why this is hurting you, why this is hurting our future. And what do? They hunker down in it because now they got to defend it. So what you have just done is actually make it worse, right? So all these communications and messaging that we're sort of doing and trying to make it better, right, lobbing it on. And I'm a data person, so that's what I do for a living. I'm a social scientist. I got so much data. I'm swimming in data all day long, right? I got a response for an evidence-based, data-backed, data-driven response to every single argument you can give me about the reforms that we have suggested don't make sense. I got data for every single one. And what I'm saying to you from a scientific perspective is lobbing that over consistently is backfiring on us. And so what I thought I would do is provide some of the backfire from people, right? If you want to know, right? If you want to know about it, talk to folks. So I don't think that, let's see if it'll play. Okay, so it won't play in the screen, but I'm going to try to, let's see how facile I am with some of the backfire. So the first clip I want to play you is a clip that came from what we do at that Frameworks called on-the-street interviews. We go on the street and we give them the traditional messaging that folks of us who are trying to get reform often do. So we might go and we say, mandatory sentences are really doing nothing more than putting people in jail. There's no relationship between the severity of punishment, the length of punishment, and crime rates. So in other words, if your real interest is safety, you aren't getting any safer because you're locking folks up, right? There's no relationship between the two. So we say that. And I want to play for you what we tend to get back.
Are there things you would think of that would improve the system?
Yeah, I'm sure there are, but I don't know if I can think of anything.
If people knew like a harsh truth or a harsh type of punishment that would happen if you did this, we would have less crime.
Punishments should be a little bit more harsh.
If your crime's bad enough, I don't think we should just allow people just to get away with that.
If you're chasing someone on the freeway, you should be able to shoot them.
People wouldn't mess with everybody if they thought they were carrying a gun.
You know, I like to see more public displays of the law. Like back in the West, you know, you get hung in front of the whole town. You know, it was different.
So y'all hear that? They said if you're chasing people on the street, you should be able to just shoot them. Just shoot them. The woman said if you're chasing somebody on the street, if you're police or whatever it is, and you're chasing somebody and you can't get them, you should be able to just shoot them. The last brother said, listen, back in the Old West, they used to hang folk. So one of the reasons that I chose those particular set of clips is because I wanted you to see the diversity of folks saying the kind of stuff that we're talking about, right? We're talking about the severity of punishment and why that is not related to crime rates. And what we're getting back, so what you didn't see is what we actually read to them, but we told them that those things are not related to safety. And what did we get back? Punish them? Punish them stronger? If they knew there was a big punishment on the other end, that they would, we made that logical argument, right? So I love the clip there. I just told you there's no relationship between the two things. And what you told me was do more of the same thing. So I'm going to show you, so this is clip 2. Clip 2 is when we talked about mass incarceration, the fact that there's a lot of, there are disparities in sentencing that don't make a whole lot of sense for minorities. People of color are more likely to be both in the system and sentenced at greater rates. And we asked people what they thought about that and what could be done about that. And here's what they said. Clip.
And why would you say some people end up in that system and other people don't?
Their father might have some kind of bad background.
You need to go into the family and find out maybe what's going on.
The way we raise our children, how they were raised.
How their parents raised them.
Because they think they can get away with it, and they don't.
You make your own decisions in there whether to become better or to become worse.
Because some people make wrong decisions.
When it comes to that point, if they're going to make the wrong decision or if they're going to make the right decision.
For having put themselves in that position.
They really need to pay the price of what they've done wrong.
Yeah, too bad. You should have done something about it.
It's too bad. Y'all should have done something about that. I mean, these folks said tell their parents. Their parents didn't raise them right. Tell them to make better decisions, right? So we just told you, right, and we tried to bring in some of the structural, we just told you a whole series of things that tried to broaden out that conversation, and what we got back was bad people, bad parents, bad choices, bad decisions. You do better, right? So the last one I want to show, and this is really an important one, we tried to get to more structural understanding. So we put in this notion of poverty, and we said to folks that if we think about poverty, poverty is one of the reasons why a lot of folks find themselves in the criminal justice system, and when, especially for youth, when they see their parents not working hard every day, not making a good living, and they see there's an opportunity to potentially make some fast cash, a whole range of things, it pushes them into pathways that they might not otherwise choose if there was, right, sort of better income streams in the family. And so we asked folks, how do you think about that? The fact that folks are in the system not because they're bad folks, but because, right, of a whole lot of social circumstances beyond their control. And here's what they said.
Life's hard. It's supposed to be hard. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger. All the bad cliches you can think of. I mean, there's been people that have come from absolutely nothing to make it. Whatever society's eyes deem success.
Well, the person has to be willing first to change themselves.
You're looking for that Cinderella story at that point. You're looking for the guy or the girl that came from the worst situation possible, but made the most of themselves.
Man said life's supposed to be hard. Who told you life was supposed to be easy? He said, we're looking for the folks that are come from nothing and have been able to make something of themselves. Did y'all hear that language? I hope that you sort of came to the same place that I have when I looked at that. But that is what we're talking about in terms of a backfire effect. That's exactly what happens when you walk this conversation, the richness of this conversation that we just had, when you walk that language out in the way we just did it, that's exactly what comes back at us. Now, what I want to say about that is there are lots of things that we as advocates tend to do to try and overcome it. So you all have encountered this, if you all have been trying to walk this language out. One thing we try to do over here is we try to yell louder. Because we think that if we just yell louder, so every morning, Sunday morning talk shows, you all get that they try to yell, MSNBC, they got folks yelling at each other, because they yell at each other louder. Or we think that if we could just get enough stories in the newspapers like everybody else that have our point of view, that people would come back. And I'm here to tell you that if we had 1,000 more stories on the front page of the newspapers with our message, guess what would happen? 1,000 more comments that look exactly like that. So, and if you doubt that, just Google, and I do this all the time, go to like New York Times or Washington Post or wherever you are, and just click in like criminal justice reform or something like that, and click a story where they're talking about reform and that kind of, and then look at the comment box. Just look at hundreds and hundreds of comments that sound exactly like what I just shared with you. So it's not that we need more, although it would be useful, right, to get more perspective on things more news stories that share our perspective. That ain't the answer. Some of us think that we can lobby our way out of this, that we can, if we just got enough stakeholders around the table to make some decisions that are different, that we could solve the problem. Now, what's interesting about this one, this sort of advocacy approach is really useful because we are seeing traction in terms of our advocacy efforts in the policy realm, and I think that some interesting things are about to happen. What's interesting and what I want to say to you about that is, if that's all that we're doing, we're in trouble. Because if you're not bringing the public along, we're going to continually be refighting this battle every 10 years for the same ground, right? Because if you're not bringing the public along and you're only bringing the policymakers that are sitting in those seats today, tomorrow you got to refight that same battle. We have to take advantage of the opportunity to completely change the narrative so that folks understand why the system is not working and really what would make that fundamentally better. In the same way that you were talking about Germany, there's a fundamental difference in understanding about who we are as a people that won't let, right, the same kind of criminal justice system that we have here operate in another place, and that's where we're trying to go. And let's be thoughtful about that in terms of it's not just policy, it's really changing the perspective that our culture brings to thinking about these kind of issues. Now, this is the one I love, the tissue box stuff. There are those of us to think if we tell enough sob stories about what happened to people and how families have been destroyed, that if we just tell that story right, I have some social advocates who said to me, if I can get people to have videos and if they can just cry 3 times in the middle of that story, I know I got them. And I'm here to tell you that while emotional appeal is important, you can't sustain that. How many of you have gone to a movie where it was a really sad movie and you went and you cried all through the movie and it was just awful, and then after the movie and you went home and you were sad about that and you said, you know what, after about an hour, I'm hungry. Let's go out to dinner. And so the ability to keep people emotionally angry or frustrated or sad is almost impossible. People, right, you can't do that. So emotionalism is important, but you can't sustain that kind of, right, the kind of emotional power in that way that would force people to stay in that kind of point of view that would help them to see that. So it's not that emotion is not important, but we got to be careful about how we use it in our messaging. And then finally, this is my favorite because this is where I live all day long. It's a data world. I went to grad school because I thought I could change the world through data. I thought if I just had enough data and I could show people my charts and graphs, that they would get it. And guess what? They refute the evidence. Well, that study is biased, and that study, that study that said how, but, right? And so, again, the backfire effect. And then the last one I'll share is what we tend to do, right, for those of us who are better financed, which is the sort of granddaddy of them all, is we like celebrities. We go and get Matt Damon and Oprah and all kind of folks to like stand up and do, because we did, and Alicia Keys, and they stand up and they do a video. Now, let me just say that all of these things are important to an advocacy strategy. We need to get our stuff out. We need to make sure that we're tapping into people's emotions. We need to make sure we're tapping stakeholders. We need to make sure potentially we got high-profile people repeating our message, and we need data. But what I want to say to you and what I want to make clear, if you don't get anything from my presentation but this, to be real clear, those things in isolation will not solve the backfire effect. It will not solve that, and we're going to keep treading this water over and over again, right? So this backfire effect, and I put up here, that the sort of, again, this notion that from an evidence-based perspective, more and more of that over and over again pushes people back into their positioning. So I think the strategies that both Al and I have both shared, I'm going to share a couple additional ones, are trying to get folks up and over that backfire, are trying to get people out of their predispositions. And the good news for you is, now that I depressed the hell out of you, hopefully, I want to bring you back around and say there really are ways to get people up and over that, but you got to be thoughtful about the messaging. So let me just talk just really quickly, just so that we all are clear about why that backfire is happening, so that we know kind of the strategy for getting us out of it. One, it's happening because confirmation bias. Right, how our brain works. When people say things to you that you already know and believe, you're more likely to believe it and think about it uncritically. For me, I put the scale up here because that's about how I think about things. I get on the scale every morning. If it says something I like, I jump off, woohoo, right? If it doesn't, I get off, I get on, I get off, I get on, because it's something, right? And the same thing is with the information. The information that we have and we're trying to get out in public is not information that folks already believe or understand. So they will not uncritically accept what we have to say. They push back, they push back, they push back, they push back. It's also happening because of implicit bias. We have a lot of information in the justice space that's talking now about implicit bias and the fact that that bias is very racially disposed. We know that, and so that is another reason why you get pushback on the issues that we're talking about. And then finally, there's this issue about what I would say is exactly talking about this issue of American exceptionalism and rugged individualism, which is this notion, I have this quote by Martin Luther King, too, that says, this country has socialism for the rich, but rugged individualism for the poor. Pull yourselves up by your bootstraps, right? Because we believe so fervently in that, and that is a kind of cultural ethos. Almost everything we do, the pushback, the backfire, comes back with that kind of ethos. So, having said that, I'm going to just conclude with a couple things. One, we know that messaging matters, but here's what I want to say that I think can be very useful about, that I really think is important about thinking about messaging. One of the most important things about messaging is that storytelling matters. The story that we're telling matters. The way that story is configured matters. But I want to tell you why it matters. People always say storytelling is important. Yeah, got it. Here's why it's important. A part of the reason why storytelling is important is because the way that our brains actually process stories is different from the way they process sort of fact-based messaging. When people listen to stories, they're interacting as if they were inside of that story. So let me give you an example. You go to a movie theater, and it's a scary movie people are watching, and somebody from the back yells, no, don't go that way. Go left, go right? Right? They're doing that because their brains are actually acting as if they are inside of the story. And that is incredibly important. The reason that's incredibly important is because they now see an interest in what's happening, and they're much more likely to empathize with the kind of choices that folks are making inside of that story. So the power of storytelling is really about people's ability to see themselves inside of it. And here's a problem with our storytelling. The folks that we're talking to, they don't see themselves in our story. I'm sorry that happened to you a long time ago. You were in that community, and I'm sorry. But what does that have to do with me? I mean, I'm struggling. I got 2 kids at home. I got to make breakfast, right? I don't see myself inside your story. And the problem for us is that is the whole power of storytelling. That's it, right? If you go to MGM and every other place where they're making stories in Hollywood, that's the power of what they're doing. They're placing you inside the story. If that's the advantage of storytelling, and we are not building our stories in ways that that they can see themselves inside of it, we just lost the boat. We just lost all the power of the stories that we're trying to tell. So what I'm here to say to you first and foremost is, and as this quote says, we as a species are addicted to story. That's the way we think, that's the way our brains process information. If we're addicted to that kind of storytelling, but yet the storytelling we're doing doesn't allow folks to see themselves as part of it, we just lost all the real estate that we're trying to move forward. So I think I'm going to stop there. I think I have a lot more to say about about how the current story is configured, and a lot of the metaphors that I think Frameworks has worked on. For those of you who are interested, Frameworks has developed a series of metaphors where you can actually see the conversation shift, where they're talking about, initially when we talk to folks like we did on the street, they're talking about families and individuals and bad parents and bad stories, but you can see in relationship to the kind of metaphors that we're positioning, people are all of a sudden start talking about structures, and they start talking about systems, and they start talking about reform in a different kind of way. So I guess what I want to end by saying is, on a hopeful note, we can do this, but we got to get strategic and we got to get thoughtful.
Powerful, powerful. Storytelling. How to tell a story smarter, how to tell a story better, how to make it more effective, and communicate with folks that may not be connected. I mean, let me just reiterate how blessed we are today, and I encourage and urge each one of you to go to the websites, Framework Institute, Opportunity Agenda, and Enterprise Partners. And there's a wealth of material that just goes into detail about these brief presentations that were given today. Now, I know somebody has a question, comment, story about, yes, ma'am, here we are. Can we hear her?
Yeah. Hi, everybody. My name is Elena Retona, and I'm the executive director of the Anyway, thank you both. I am very believer in stories, that we are there for stories, and we are meeting our stories, which is fantastic. The one thing that I wanted to comment on is that I'm here with my compañero de lucha de fe, and we are not advocates, we are organizers. And so something that I felt was missing is power, right, in a very different way of thinking about change, that is not about trying to convince somebody to like me, but it's really about giving power to those that are very directly affected. And so I wanted to use a couple of examples of how messaging for me is about power. Black Lives Matter inherently is about power. You're illegal inherently is about power. And the way that we are seeing ourselves in that story, clearly it resonates in a very racist society to quote somebody like me illegal, because it makes me feel superior over you. So Black Lives Matter meme, it makes somebody like me feel powerful in that story. And then the last example I'm going to share with you from your presentation, Tiffany, was Martin Luther King's quote, when he says socialism is for the rich and individual progressivism is for the poor. He is in a very explicit way with power at the center. So I just wanted to mention that because there's still a very big believer that what we need more than anything is to reframe our stories that are very much in a power frame to begin shifting the way that we ourselves see ourselves in those stories. Thank you.
Alan, did you have something?
Sure, I can start. Yeah, thank you very much for that. And I think that I guess I have two kinds of thoughts. I certainly agree. I think part of my point about lifting up the voices of those most affected is partly about that power piece, right? In other words, that the solution is going to come not from so-called experts, not from universities, but from the people who are living the experience and understand both the causes and the solutions. And literally, the power of people telling their own stories is empowering to people like them who are able to see it. But it has to go hand in hand with organizing, right? We can't rely purely on communications to carry that water. A related point is the value of agency and power. So, si se puede, and yes, we can. The same meaning, but two examples from the message there is. In the Obama administration, literally, we're the solution that we're looking for, right? Those are empowerment messages. They're also hope messages that things can change. So it's not just you understand your situation, good luck to you, but actually we have the power to change that situation. Exactly. Absolutely crucial. I agree. And one of the reasons why we used a superhero was primarily because we know that folks who are working for change in our communities, especially those who are directly affected by challenges, are already heroes. And part of our goal at the Opportunity Agenda is help them be superheroes.
I'll tell you, these graphic novels are just taking over the world. Yes, ma'am. Oh, and then we'll go right to you at the mic.
Why don't you go first?
Yeah.
Okay, that's fine. Thanks. I just had two questions. Did any of your research show that cost had anything to do with the data that people listen to saving money? Just was wondering if that wasn't mentioned in your slides. And one of the strategic intervention points in the criminal justice system is legal intervention, trying to get the courts to make decisions that impact the realities of either laws or and I was wondering if you have done any research or have any information about how those individual judges who hold power have been more impacted besides the legal analysis and the strategies around statutes, but do you have any relationship about reaching them in a storytelling way or research? This is some of the work that I do. I was just curious to show what the research might show about how we might address those judges who literally sit and can make a decision about XYZ, have profound impact on the criminal justice system. If there's anything that's specific to those powerful people around storytelling or reaching them emotionally in addition to how they're trained as lawyers, if you show or could give any advice about that.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Tiffany.
So I would say that there is a lot of information about cost. I think the best way to think about cost in the system is to think about the motivation for a lot of the interesting bedfellows in the policy space who are now sort of backing all kind of interesting progressive reforms. We have folks who are in the conversation about mass incarceration who were never there before. We have the Koch brothers who are, on every other social issue, not in an interesting space for us, but now are very interested in this issue. And I think there are a lot of folks on the right who would normally not be in these conversations. And one of the reasons, not all, but one of the reasons why they're in this conversation has to do with cost. They think that we are spending too much money, right, to put all these folks in jail. It's costing us a lot of money. It's pissing them off, basically, if I can be as provocative to say something like that. So I think the way I think about that is mostly like what's bringing folks to the table. That's one of the things that's bringing these really unconventional folks to the table of the issues around mass incarceration. Having said that, from a framing perspective, you can certainly bring that up in your messaging. I certainly would not put that at the top of a messaging frame, because when you put this issue in a cost framework, while it may win the day on some of these issues in terms of mass incarceration, what's really challenging is it comes back to bite us, because the same folks who are saying it's too much money to keep you in jail are the same folks who are saying it's too much money to educate your children. It's too much money to make sure you have health care. It's too much money to make sure you have living wages, right? And so once you cue that up and you get people going down that road, it's hard to bring them back to a more just social justice frame. So I'd say cost is a consideration. We certainly want to build that into our messaging, but that cannot be the kind of meta frame that we go out on.
Thanks. Yes, ma'am.
Yep. Can I just add quickly? I definitely agree on that. On the judge's question, we're seeing this with Justice Kennedy on the Supreme Court. His evolution on issues of LGBT equality and even on race, which I never would have predicted, and I've argued in the Supreme Court, is not about briefs. It's not about legal briefs. It's about the changes that he's seeing in society and what he's learning about inequality and what the Constitution ought to mean. And so my first lesson was about audience, and we need to think of judges as audiences just like anybody else. There are some ethical rules about how we can approach and communicate with them, especially for lawyers, but they are an audience like no other in many ways.
So you're saying there's hope for Clarence Thomas? Go ahead.
I did not say that.
They're going to quote you.
I don't think that's what the brother said.
I just want to really thank you two. I'm really grateful because we have a huge messaging problem. I come from the mental health door instead of the prison door, and so what they're saying is, let's take folks out of the jail and let's lock them up in mental hospitals. And so it's the same folks we're talking about. The issue is let's force them into treatment, whether that be addictions treatment or mental health treatment. So we have this huge problem. I was telling you the Spotlight series in the Globe right now is doing The Desperate and the Dead. I'm a person with bipolar illness. I'm very out about it. And so it's saying people like me kill our parents and we kill our children. That's the whole thing. And then the Globe's response, they say the Spotlight team is independent. You know, we got an Academy Award, blah, blah, blah. But their response is forced treatment, which is involuntary outpatient commitment. We are one of only 4 states that doesn't have it. And so this series is horrendous. We've tried to meet with Michael Resendez, you know, whoever's movie star played him in the movie. We've tried to meet with Brian McGrory, their editor, the chief editor. We've tried to meet with the editor. So we tried that strategy. We've tried the strategy of direct action. August 1st, 12 of us were arrested. We had 200 people. We were highlighting the number of people killed by the mental health system and shot by cops. There's almost 300 people nationwide in the last year. But like some of us say, we just need to get out these positive stories about those of us with mental illness living our lives. And then, you know, we've done every single trap you're talking about. We have not done what you're doing. And this is like really, really helpful. So it's kind of more of a comment. And if anyone has, you know, as a group, those of us labeled with a mental health condition are also at the bottom, whether we've been incarcerated or not. So, of how the public thinks. They think lock us up. So if you have, you know, continue getting your information out there. I guess I don't have a specific question, just we're really floundering, and the Globe articles keep getting worse and worse and worse. They say, oh, we hear you. I have an uncle with mental illness. That's what they tell me.
Well, yeah, I wanted to mention something you and I discussed. We're in an era, for the first time in human history, everyone in this room has the power and ability to communicate with millions of people and to for them to communicate back. We have the ability to be storytellers that we didn't have. So, you know, we heard the example of Black Lives Matter. That was specifically a response to, among other things, the failure of mainstream media to cover the deaths of black and brown people at the hands of police and to cover them in a way that reflects our humanity and the call for justice. They forced the movement, and starting in social media, literally forced the mainstream media to act, and it's increasingly moving the political decision makers to have to act. That's easier said than done, but I think, you know, that we have to use those workarounds, which we didn't used to have. The mainstream media used to be the ultimate gatekeeper on how to get the message out, and that's no longer the case.
Okay, well, so we just this young lady, and then last question with you, and then we'll try to wrap up here. So, yes, ma'am.
Okay, I have a question about something that both of you touched on. I'm seeing a lot of criminal justice nonprofits feeling this tension between the empathizing route of, you know, when they're talking to mostly white legislators and policy experts and trying to get them to understand the criminal justice issues, of whether they're bringing race into it, because obviously that's going to be harder for mostly white people to understand. So this kind of race-neutral criminal justice policy of if we talk about mass incarceration without bringing up the racial disparities, if we talk about, you know, mental health, all these different avenues in which people go to prison without bringing up the facts about race, some nonprofits see it as easier that way versus we're going to bring up the tension that it's going to be harder for policymakers to understand this, and maybe they'll be slower to act because they can't put themselves in the place of people of color. But, you know, in the long run, maybe it will be worth it because we're also tackling systemic oppression. So I'm wondering if you guys have any, take on that strategic choice and advice for how to lessen that tension.
All right, thank you.
So I'll start with that. So the way that I think about these issues is that it should never be a choice about whether or not you bring race into the conversation or not. It is a part of the conversation. The only choice to be made is how you position it in the story that you're telling. And for some folks who really get it, you know that they already have an understanding, a nuanced understanding of how race and how the people's predispositions and implicit bias shapes their understanding. that means you don't have to do so much work early on in the story to kind of get them to where you want them to go. So that kind of explanation and thoughtfulness may not be as rigorous as when you're in front of policymakers. So policymakers, you come, if the first line in your messaging or your story is about race, it's going to be an uphill battle. But the way to do it is to get it in there in a different way. So, and Frameworks talks a lot about this. One of the metaphors that we developed around the justice issue is talking about the maze. I wish I had a little bit more time to talk about how that really allows you to get systemic privilege and bias around what's in the system into the conversation. That then opens the door to talk about how lots of folks have privileges, then they can buy themselves through the maze. So we talk about the justice system as being a maze. You go in and who knows, right? Most people get stuck in it because they can't figure out how to get out. And once you're in this, it really gets tough. And some people can buy themselves navigation or guides through lawyers and other things to get themselves out of it. But not everybody has that opportunity. And so once you begin to use those kind of metaphors, you open the door to then be able to talk about, well, what are the kind of privileges that people have when they need to navigate through the system? One is resources, just straight up money. When you got more money, you can navigate a little better. One is the fact that your skin color can also do some navigation. And so, again, it's not a choice of whether or not to bring in race. It's about how much you got to do to kind of get people to get that in the story and to be thoughtful about how you're doing it.
Yeah, I absolutely agree, and I would just add quickly, one very practical thing is that the Opportunity Agenda, we're doing a webinar this coming week on Thursday on talking about race in a variety of contexts. So you can go to our website, opportunityagenda.org. You can sign up for the webinar. There's going to be we'll be producing a messaging memo or releasing a messaging memo after that on talking about race, not just in the criminal justice context, but in a variety of contexts. And the last thing I would say is that people's conscious values about race are much more positive than their subconscious stereotypes. And so lifting up, telling the positive story, using some of the lessons that I described here, telling the positive story about why we have to have a criminal justice system that keeps all communities safe, that prevents crime, and that upholds our national values of equal justice. I challenge lawmakers, for example, to disagree with those principles. Once you are talking about the values that are at stake and how those values protect all of us, then people are much more able to hear the specific solutions and challenges to achieving them. If we're silent about race, to Tiffany's point, if you say people with criminal convictions or people who have felonies, folks are already carrying around a picture in their head of who that is, and it's not white folks. So we need to recognize that race is in the conversation and lift it up as part of the conversation. And we have to do that strategically. There will be times those should be the first words out of your mouth about race, and other times when it's going to be a secondary argument, but we can't afford to leave it unsaid.
Right. Okay, sir.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if you found it useful to bring a powerful image or proverb or message from one sector to another. I'm mostly a public health person for the last 40-some years, but now I'm spending a lot of time with this criminal justice system problem. And a very powerful message in our public health world is it takes a village to raise a child. African proverb. Everybody uses that for the last 25 years now. And it means something. It's a collective responsibility. There's a lot to it. It's not just doctors providing medical care to make you healthy. I just wonder, some of us have tried to start saying something like, well, it takes a whole village to put one in jail, too, i.e. it's not an individual responsibility. It's a collective responsibility, and that I don't hear that said enough, I guess, with justice. You do something horrible, and all of a sudden, it's just your responsibility. We don't even want to talk about it. It's nobody else's responsibility. I don't know, just back to the question, is it useful to, use something powerful from one place to this place?
Dr. Tiffany.
So absolutely, and I think the thing that you're trying to get at, which goes completely against the grain of this sort of rugged individualism, is that communities or your social environment matters. There's an ecosystem around each one of us that shapes all kinds of outcomes that happen to you as an individual, and there is this kind of interplay. And when we talk about these issues, what immediately comes back at us is personal responsibility. Yes, that's personal responsibility, but if you can't get the sort of broader conversation. If you can't get people there to this notion that community matters, places matter, what's around folks matters, then it's really hard to get people to think about systems and how we might change them and our collective responsibility. So there are a lot of things that are coming out of other kind of sectors that can be useful. I think in the health space, the social determinants of health is really interesting for us, at least for stakeholder audiences, because in health we understand that the majority of the health outcomes are not the outcomes. The best outcomes are shaped not by what happens in your doctor's office, but actually what happens when you go home and the community in which you live. And the health field is now kind of getting that. And so I think it's a really powerful way to think about our work, where the determinants of whether or not you find yourself in the system or not really have to do with all the things that are around you and how are we providing those kind of supports. In the housing, we think about housing as a platform for these other kinds of things that are happening around you. So I think there are these kind of, this note, we're all coalescing in these individually across these sectors and trying to get people to think about broader community spaces and how we get that into the messaging. But it's really tough because every time you do that, you're coming against the kind of the very thing that is at the heart of who we are in terms of our identity. But that really is the essential fight that we're having, whether we call it that or not, right? A different kind of identity.
And Alan, if you could give us our last word here.
Last word. Now it's too much pressure. I did want to respond to that. In addition to once again agreeing with Tiffany, some of the most pivotal research on framing and messaging around criminal justice was social science research finding, talking to two groups, talking with one about crime using metaphors of combat, right? War on crime. We've got to, combat crime, and with another group talking about crime as a disease. Crime has been infecting our communities. We need to make sure that we're using treatment and the like. And then later asking both groups to answer the same set of questions about policy positions. And, as you'd expect, given the buildup, the people who heard crime as disease were much more likely to talk about the importance of mental health treatment, the importance of alternatives to incarceration, et cetera. The crime as combat folks are much more likely to go directly to policing and lock them up and the like. So those metaphors and the frames, the mental frames that they represent, are absolutely crucial. My last piece is going to be, I'm going to tell you again, opportunityagenda.org. Go to our website, sign up. These webinars are coming. We release materials, so if something happens like as happened in New York City, a police officer was tragically shot and killed, apparently by somebody who went through a diversion program and would, but for the diversion program, might not have been on the street to kill the police officer. We knew that that was going to lead to a series of rhetorical attacks on diversion programs. And so we were able to send out messaging to the field about recommendations on how to talk about the fact that, number one, honor the life that was lost, be open to examining the particular decision that was made regarding this, the accused person, but then, and then talking about why diversion programs, alternatives to incarceration, keep us all safer, including police officers. Specific messaging on that, you can only get it by signing up, so I hope you will do that. Thanks very much.
All right.